Good afternoon, and thank you so much for being here today. I'm Bella Tonkanogi, Senior Director of Global Programs at Climate Policy Initiative, where we have been tracking, analyzing, and developing models for climate-resilient water finance for a number of years. And it's a great pleasure for CPI to co-host this important conversation with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank on the key challenges and promising solutions in the water sector. So the three traditional water funding modalities, tariffs, taxes, and transfers, are under growing strain globally, and especially in developing economies where public budgets are constrained, official development assistance is declining, and household affordability challenges persist. This puts sustained investment at risk and may further widen the already significant water funding gap. At the same time, hydrological systems across the world are being destabilized by climate change and overuse, pushing many regions toward what the UN defines as water bankruptcy. So today's session responds to this reality by first outlining governance pathways for managing water in this evolving context, and second, by exploring the role of innovative models in addressing this persistent funding challenge. We will begin with keynote remarks from President and Chair of the Board of Directors of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, Ms. Jo Jai. She will be followed by a presentation from the AIIB Chief Economist team to launch their important and inspiring report, Where the Water Flows, a title reminiscent of Rumi's famous poem in which he wrote, "Life blossoms wherever water flows." We will then transition to a panel discussion with some of the world's leading experts and practitioners in water, climate, and development finance and policy. So with that, it is my great honor to invite our keynote speaker, Ms. Jo, to the podium. Please join me in welcoming her.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for the launch of AIIB's flagship research report, Asian Infrastructure Finance 2026, Where the Water Flows. Water is emerging as a defining constraint on growth, resilience, and development. It is a pleasure to present this report here in Washington, D.C. during the spring meetings, at a time when water is receiving renewed attention across the development community. Increasingly, it is seen not only as an environmental concern, but as a fundamental driver of economic stability, food security, and long-term growth. Let me highlight 3 points from the report. First, water must be understood as a system that underpins economic activity across countries, sectors, and regions. The global water cycle links economies beyond national borders and shapes the function of agriculture, energy systems, and cities. What happens in one place increasingly has consequences elsewhere. Water risks, therefore, are no longer local or sectorial. They are systemic. Second, addressing these risks require a more integrated approach to infrastructure. We need to invest both in engineered systems, such as water supply, irrigation, and flood protection, and also in the natural system that sustain the water cycle, including forests, wetland, and river basins. These are not competing priorities. They are complementary, and both are essential for building resilience in a changing climate. Third, we face a significant gap between the scale of the challenge and the level of investment. Public finance is critical but it is not sufficient on its own. Stronger policy frameworks, better pricing mechanisms, and improved governance are needed to attract private capital and support sustainable water management. Technology also has an important role to play, from improved data and monitoring to more efficient water use in agriculture and industry. For AIIB, this is closely aligned with our core mandate. We work with our members to support infrastructure that is sustainable, climate resilient, and fit for the future. In practice, this means helping countries translate water challenges into investable projects wherever in urban systems, agriculture, or climate resilience, and supporting solutions that integrate both natural and engineered approaches. The purpose of this report is to help reframe how we think about water in the context of infrastructure and investment, and to support more informed and coordinated action. No single country or institution can address these challenges alone. But by working together across sectors, across regions, and across institutions, we can make meaningful progress. We look forward to working with our members and partners to turn this agenda into concrete investments. Thank you.
Thank you, President Zhou, for your important remarks and highlighting your key message in the report that what has often been managed as a sectoral issue is emerging as a broader constraint on growth and resilience. Now we will hear from Eric Bergloff and Jiangping Thea on AIB's new report, Where the Water Flows. They'll walk us through how to transition from the fragmented approaches that characterize much of today's water resource management toward a more systemic model of water resilience. Please come on up, Eric and JP.
Thank you. So let me add my welcome to that of our president. So thank you very much for joining us. It's very exciting. You know, there's a lot of work behind a report like this, and it's a pleasure particularly to present it here in Washington and during the spring meetings where there is so much thinking and so much knowledge and so much opportunities for meaningful discussion. So water is really, it makes up the circulatory system of nature. It reaches and regulates all the major components of Earth. But despite this importance, we have tended to look at water through a fragmented lens. So we saw it as a resource to be extracted, as a hazard to be managed, as a service to be delivered through pipes and pumps. What this report tries to do is to think about how we can adopt a broader and deeper perspective and how we can view the global water cycle itself as critical natural infrastructure. You know, normally when we talk about infrastructure, we think and water infrastructure, we think of dams, levees, and aqueducts. This kind of gray concrete that we put in place to control the flow of water. But we don't think so much about what really propels the water cycle, the energy of the sun and all the earth systems that come together to produce this critical water cycle. And you know, all human activity, all life on Earth depends on this cycle. It performs a lot of very important functions. You know, it's a powerful pump with forests transpiring moisture and replenishing giant atmospheric flows of fresh water and it's a global thermostat. It's regulating climate through evaporation and cloud formation. It's a giant filter as water percolates through the soils and wetlands and emerges purified. It is, in essence, the planet's own life support system. So what does it help us to frame the water cycle in these terms? We believe that this is critical to making progress along the lines that the President outlined, where we need to think in systemic terms. What is the replacement cost of this natural system? What are the risks of its degradation? How do we invest in its maintenance and make it more resilient? And when we look around, and we have done quite a lot of analytical work, the answers are really sobering. Our collective actions, clearing forests, draining wetlands, emitting greenhouse gases, are really dismantling this very infrastructure. We are altering this delicate balance of evaporation, condensation, and flow that has sustained stable climates and water availability for millennia. The result is a less predictable, more volatile water cycle, manifesting itself in more extreme floods and severe droughts. The problems here is at least in part, one of governance. There are this water cycle does not respect borders. The water basins of river basins often span several countries. These atmospheric flows even transcend continents, and all this creates problems for governance. I think the good news here, and I'm going to end on this, the good news is that we have now science, we have tools that can monitor these water flows. We can trace water through nature across countries and across continents. And that's going to open completely new possibilities for governing these water resources and reinforcing the water cycle. Much more powerful ways of financing these investments that we need to make, both in this cycle itself, but also managing the cycle over time and making it more resilient. I want to leave the floor now to JP, who has been leading the work on this report. Please, JP.
Thank you, President Joe, Eric, and for all the inspiring remarks. And I will just very quickly walk you through the report, maybe not taking more than 5 to 7 minutes. I cannot go through the rich report. The team back in Beijing did a really, really good job, but I'll just highlight a few key points which I think really underscores the key messages of this report. Eric has mentioned water is a global interconnected system. The cycle is shifting, the risks are rising, it is a food risk, it's an economic risk, it's a systemic risk, and the current approach is a little bit fragmented and it has to be improved. It is a critical infrastructure. All the services that are provided are so critical to us. In fact, built infrastructure is actually supported by the flows in the natural cycle. Built infrastructure just doesn't exist in a vacuum in its own context. This is one of our favorite chapters that called Flying Rivers. So we work with the University of Turin. We amass an amount of data. The data comes from them. They helped us, but we process a lot of data. We created an input-output table. Country by country, we show where the moistures are coming from which country, where the moisture is being sent to which country. On the top right-hand side, you can see Amazon Basin. Amazon's basin's moisture supplies spreads over so many regions in America and to the extent even Africa. The second picture, Congo. If you look at Congo, Congo's basin is so important in distributing moisture in Africa and to the extent even reaching Indian subcontinent. In fact, I was very surprised to even see that Congo, in the middle chart, is actually supplying some of the moisture to the Amazon basin itself. So whatever happens in Congo basin affects not only West Africa, it has the effect on India as well as even Americas. If you cut down the forest there, you lose the ability of the forest to pump this kind of atmospheric moisture. Indonesia is critical in Asia. You look at the spread of the Indonesian moisture across the entire South Asia and a little bit to the East Asia and South Asia as well. Our team created this large bilateral kind of input-output table detailing the importance of cross-border flows. And it also highlights that there is an externality, right? So whatever happens in a domestic boundary, like President mentioned, has got effect across the system, across the border. We run a lot of regression, and we we just want to underscore the message. Forests and wetlands remain very important propagation mechanism, landscapes that propagate water across border. Urban areas, built-up areas, the sign is negative. Whenever there's too much built-up area, the propagation mechanisms stop. Inland regions like Mongolia, Central Asia are going to be very dry and hot given climate change, and they depend on the forests elsewhere, in India, in China, to help bring the moisture inland. Inland areas do not generate their own moisture and depend critically on moistures that are coming elsewhere. This really shows you the extent of the system that we are dealing with. This is so important. Glacier melting has already captured the attention. Many AIIB members in Asia, ranging from Southeast Asia, South Asia, West Asia to Central Asia, will to various degrees be affected by this, right? So there is a lot of infrastructure needs over the next 20, 30 years, stabilizing the slopes, stabilizing the river banks, strengthening flood control, strengthening disaster management, where if the glacier dams break accidentally, strengthening local community infrastructure, and so on. Great demand here, affecting livelihoods from farmers to cities, and so on. Very important thing. Water stress is an economic stress, is an economic risk. It affects agriculture, food system, it impacts biodiversity. Whenever there's overuse of water, it is not only the human communities that are affected, the animals, the biodiversity in the nature are affected with reduced environmental flow. It is systemic across. Let me come to the second part. Water infrastructure is key to resilience in a new normal, new abnormal. And we need both types of gray and engineered infrastructure as well as nature infrastructure. Let me highlight again a few examples. We need to build up water resilience against, I mentioned some of this, guard against glacier melts, higher temperature, greater climate volatility. Irrigation systems are critical. There are a few chapters in the report detailing the different types of irrigation systems and how to improve the governance. And increasingly, this investment decision will need to be there to help build the resilience. But remember, our second key message is that nature infrastructure is equally important. Don't just do the gray infrastructure. We have a vision as a bank, not to be the bank of only the gray infrastructure engineered solutions, but also have finance and projects and investments towards the green infrastructure, the wetlands, river basins, forests that Eric, President, mentioned. This has to work hand in hand in a complementary fashion. So AIIB has an ambition, not just to be an engineered infrastructure bank, but also bank for nature, ecosystem, and so on. Working together, let me quickly skip that. Water stress is increasingly impacting economies. Governance, including pricing, remains key. This is one of the charts I like the most, and also let me explain, right? So some of the water stress countries are the biggest exporter of virtual water. Now, what is virtual water? Whenever you export cotton, for example, you're actually using 1 kilogram of cotton, use up 2,000 liters of water. Whenever you're exporting cotton, you're in fact drawing water from your boundaries and exporting the water embedded in the cotton. It happens for coffee, it happens for agriculture, wheat, maize, huge water export through this kind of embedded water, virtual water. The summary of this slide shows that some of our AIIB members, including those who are water stressed, are some of the largest exporters of this virtual water. For example, India, Pakistan are some of the most water-stressed countries, but they are also the largest exporter of virtual water. On the right-hand side, right-hand bottom is a little bit small. You could see a downward slope. So people with more water, countries with more water on the right-hand side, they tend to have lower price. Countries with less water, they tend to have higher price. But you could see on the right-hand side chart, even though there's a general downward slope, it is very messy. The correlation is not very strong. And you could see a cluster of countries on the bottom left-hand side that are really underpricing water. The underpricing of water caused a kind of a trade distortion, and exacerbate local conditions through the excessive export of this virtual water. So it feeds back into local water stress. So we have done a lot of analysis through gravity trade models, and higher water prices really affects the amount of agriculture exports and embedded water, virtual water inside agriculture, right? Now, water pricing is critical, not just to correct the trade distortions, but water pricing is also an opportunity to crowd in private sector investments. Without pricing water, it's impossible to then bring alongside private sector to invest in PPP or structure. So pricing is not only just to correct for the use, correct for the distortion, but it's also an important mobilizer. Let me conclude by saying that we really need better instruments, including pricing, including working across boundaries, including sharing data, including private sector partnership. MDBs play a critical role, prioritizing this agenda and bringing countries together and setting the agenda and providing the finance for countries to invest in this. It is a very difficult conversation, difficult journey. It is most likely that the nature ecosystem type of investments need to come from the public sector, so that and then with proper pricing, the private sector can come in on the infrastructure side. It's a spectrum, but hopefully between MDB and the private sector, we can cover the entire spectrum and again protect the water cycle and invest in resilient infrastructure at the same time. Let me conclude with these key 4 messages: protect forests, protect ecosystem, protect water in the landscape, invest in both built and nature infrastructure, link up investments, and align governance, data, and finance to manage these shared global resources. Thank you for your time. Let me pause here and hand back to Bella.
Wow, thank you so much, Eric and JP. That is just a wildly innovative, inspiring report and message, and I think indicative of the ambition of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and really, I hope, will set the bar for the full MDB system as it moves forward around implementing Water Forward and the various nature and climate goals that the MDBs all have. Just a really incredible contribution. So let us move on to our distinguished panel. I'd like to invite them up onto the stage, and then I'll go ahead and introduce them. But please come up, panelists, and we will get started. So we have an incredible panel. Hopefully you will hear. We will have plenty of time with them, and we will also have some time for audience questions towards the end of the discussion. So I'm going to first introduce our panelists, and then we will jump into 2 rounds of conversation. The first really focused on governance, and the second on finance. So I will introduce you in the order that you're seated here. So first, we have Tim Wainwright. Tim is Chief Executive of WaterAid UK. He led the development of the organization's Global Strategy 2022 to 2032, which prioritizes strengthening the climate resilience of water solutions and increasing both the quality and quantity of funding for WASH. And Tim has been intimately involved in the launch of the Water Forward initiative, and really looking forward to hearing more from him about that. Next to him, we have Andrew Johnstone. Andrew is the co-founder and CEO of Climate Fund Managers, creator and manager of the world's largest climate-focused blended finance facility, including Climate Investor 1 and 2. Climate Investor 2 is notably focused on water, sanitation, and ocean infrastructure. I'd also like to congratulate Andrew and his team on winning Investor of the Year for Asset Manager this week at the 2026 Environmental Finance Sustainable Debt Awards. Next to Andrew, we have Andrea Erickson-Quiroz as Global Managing Director for the Provide Food and Water Sustainably priority at the Nature Conservancy. She leads global programs in water security and food systems. Her leadership has driven major initiatives, including the expansion of water funds across multiple continents. Thank you for joining us. Next, we have Dr. Arunabha Ghosh. Hello, it's great to see you again. Aranava is the founder and CEO of the Council on Energy, Environment, and Water, and has led CEEW to the top ranks as one of Asia's leading policy research institutions, and I would say one of the world's leading policy research institutions. Among many other eminent appointments, he is a member of the Global Commission on the Economics of Water. And finally, we have Eddie Iaz Vasquez. Eddie is a non-resident senior fellow in the Africa Growth Initiative at the Brookings Institution. And among previous positions at the World Bank, he was Global Senior Director for the Social, Urban, Rural, and Resilience Global Practice and Global Manager of the Water and Sanitation Program. So truly an incredible panel. Thank you so much for joining us today, and let's get started. First, talking about governance. So I will start with you, Tim, if that's all right. WaterAid is one of the world's largest nonprofits dedicated to water and sanitation. And you have so much field experience, your organization has so much field experience, so would love to kind of ground this discussion from the start in reality. Can you tell us a little bit about the governance practices you've seen most consistently underpin successful water management, both at the national level and at the basin level?
Well, thank you. Thank you, Bella, and it's great to be on this panel and a very interesting, wide-ranging group of speakers. So I'm very, very glad to be here. Yes, and so WaterAid, as you said, is a large INGO focused on water, sanitation, and hygiene. We've been doing it for 40 plus years, mostly Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. We've done quite a lot of thinking on this topic because the whole area of water governance is one of the crucial things that you need to have in place at country level to be successful. And our latest thinking on this suggests that we've got sort of 5 key areas. So I'll just run through them. So the first is role clarity, being really clear what needs to happen at national level, what needs to happen at basin level, and what needs to happen at local level. And I think linking it to Water Forward, I think that Water Forward's been quite useful in bringing the whole of the water space together in one strategy. But yes, getting clarity on who's doing what at those different levels. Secondly, and linked to that, once you know what someone's responsible for delivering, making sure that the resources are also reaching them. So you need single ownership of both the objective and the resources. And as you might expect me to say, one quite often finds one but without the other. The resources don't always reach where they are intended. Thirdly, regulation and the data needed to support it. And particularly here, making sure that there's regulation of how much water is taken, but also if water is being put back, what's going on there, and that you don't see, for instance, water quality compromised by the water that's wastewater that's flowing out. And there's a bit of peril around this area of regulation, I think, and data collection. A lot of these areas did receive funding from ODA, and as we all know, there's been a big reduction in ODA, and I'm worried that some of these enabling things for investment are maybe losing their funding. Fourth one, and there's 5 in total, the fourth one is about cross-sector coordination and making sure that all water users are regulated. Everybody who wants to use it, and it's particularly important in semi-arid areas where water is very scarce, or in areas of the world where there's very, very high extraction, such as across South Asia. So basically, particularly when water is a very scarce resource, is there regulation in place to moderate different users' take on it? And then finally, involving the community, involving the local community, both to learn from them, consult them, engage them, and give the local community opportunities to lead. And in our experience, this is great for sustainability, it's great for the involvement of women and girls, and it's great for overall equity. There you go.
Fantastic. That's a great list to get us started. I'd like to stay on the topic of policy, government, and maybe turn over to you, Aranaba. You've worked extensively across the climate and development ecosystem in government and civil society. Can you give us some lessons on water governance, both from the water sector, but also you work in other sectors, energy, anything we can draw from those lessons, and where do they fall short?
Thanks, Bella, and thank you, Eric, for inviting me. It's always great to be part of engagements with the AIIB, and CW and AIIB will have a conference in Delhi in a couple of weeks, so looking forward to that as well. But lovely to be amongst friends here. I think just picking up from where Tim left off, if since I deal with both energy and water, my biggest pet peeve is that water is kind of running about a decade and a half behind innovation and governance when it comes to, say, compared to the energy sector. That doesn't mean energy has sorted it all out, but what therefore do we learn from that? Number one is, I think we need, and Tim kind of referenced that as well, we need a clearer regulatory architecture that understands that water flows through the economy rather than water is just a singular sort of sectoral play. If you go with that singular sectoral play framing, which has historically been the way it has been approached, you end up with that classic project finance kind of approach. You just don't get the scale of investment, especially in the geographies that it's needed. When you see, as the presentation also demonstrated, water is flowing through nature, it is flowing through the economy, and therefore the productivity of water that you derive from different sectors of the economy needs to be factored in that kind of regulatory architecture. Now, what would that look like? It has to at least start by recognizing the different forms and colors of water that exists, and it's there in the AIIB report. It's there in this book that I've just published called Water, Nature, Progress. Water is both blue, but it's also green. That's in the soils. It's also gray. It is also black. Once we start recognizing that entirety of the resource, we can then see where is the best social and economic return. The other major governance innovation that is needed is really the role of utility and the role of the utilities and the role of the investors. In the energy sector, we've seen this, when you split up the monopolies on, the generation, distribution, and transmission side, you get more efficiencies. In water, you have the challenges, you have similar challenges, but because of underpricing, again, what was highlighted earlier, you end up with a situation where you don't really know who plays what role at which end of the system. How do you provide the basic minimum, to fulfill the water as a human right dimension? Where does public subsidy come in to support the underprivileged households? Or are we using public subsidy to, just underwrite the network infrastructure, et cetera? So thinking some of that through is necessary. The third thing, and here I think there is an opportunity in leveraging digital public infrastructure to gather some of that information, both on the source sustainability side, the leakages side, as well as the end sort of consumption withdrawal side. Layering that data or collecting that data and layering it through the digital public infrastructure enables or could enable a much more efficient way of understanding where the inefficiencies lie. It's the absence of that data layer in many cases and the sensitivities associated with water data. It's that lack of clarity on the regulatory architecture and the lack of clarity on who plays what role in this kind of pun intended pipeline. If we can solve for these two or three things, then I think you can begin to see that the water story can become a different kind of an investable class, but not as a sectoral silo, but as something that is flowing through the economy.
Thank you for that. Andrew, I'd like to turn over to you, coming from more the investment background. I mean, we've heard a lot of challenges in the regulatory and policy frameworks, but you're an investor, you need to make investments. You can't wait for the perfect or even the better in regulatory systems. So what do you do? How do you think about this? What kinds of investments are you making, and what do you look for in terms of governance? What is absolutely necessary?
Yes, hi. So thank you, Bella. Ladies and gentlemen, hi. As Bella introduced, I'm a fund manager. My background is an engineer, and we invest the equity component into projects. So the opening statement, the problem actually is in systems and projects. I absolutely agree with that. The challenge, however, is that at the moment, even finding revenue lines in projects is difficult, let alone in systems. So we've gravitated towards projects from an infrastructure financing paradigm, which is quite well established in terms of how one actually finances infrastructure. It's been around for a long time. And most recently, the probably evolution and the thinking around financing these type of assets does derive from the energy sector, which has all sorts of interesting characteristics which make it far easier. So the answer to Bella's question is, how do we do it in the water space, is fundamentally we take more risk. And you've got to accept that you're going to take more risk. And the risk manifests in all sorts of different areas that I can sort of touch on. But the way that we've been able to take more risk derives from the way we actually aggregate the capital. Climate fund managers is probably one of the leading practitioners in something called blended finance. And so what we do is we aggregate capital from different sources, which include donors and commercial investors and DFIs, and also we use guarantee instruments. We package it together at a fund level, not a project level, but at a fund level, to give that pool of capital a risk absorbency and a resilience that hitherto hasn't really existed in financial structures. So once you've got this pool of capital which can absorb risk, you then go out and find projects that actually are more risky than typically would be the case, or rather too risky for conventional investment instruments of senior debt and equity. And you try to find those projects that you can actually focus on the T side of the tariff part of the 3 Ts, and reduce the reliance on the taxation and transfers. So what you do through Blend is you take the transfers component in the case of donor capital, and you take the tariff component, and you staple those together, and you try and relieve the pressure on the taxes component of the Ts, and you go and finance these projects. So what is it that we actually focus on when we come down to the risk? Well, these projects are quite unique, even at project level. In the development of them, they have a peculiarity, which is the duration of the development. It takes a lot longer to develop these projects than a wind farm, for instance. And that has consequences. During the passage of time, all sorts of nasty stuff happens. Elections occur, COVID arises, wars start, and none of those are good for development. And so you then, the risk is your development runs out, you run out of money in so doing it, and you've got to make quicker decisions, more bolder decisions, and spend money quicker. And for that, you need a pool of capital which is actually sufficiently risk tolerant for that. A blended finance gives us that. Once you get into the construction stage, there are also some peculiarities. For instance, invariably, these are merchant plants, meaning that you've got end-user customers. You haven't got a bulk off-taker who's going to buy your dispatch out of a wind farm. You've got to provide the electricity to a community of users, and you've got to collect the revenue from that community, and in many instances, you're collecting in local currency. All of these have different implications on the line of sight to your revenue and how long you are able to finance it. And that's even before you get to the operational challenges like leakage, and ongoing stakeholder support. So, long answer to your question, but our solution to this is actually the utilization of blended finance, which is designed to absorb more risk than other types of financing.
Thanks, Andrew. I think that was a very helpful description of blended finance and very clear. So let me turn to Eddie now, both kind of your experience in the MDB system, which is at its best is a provider of risk capital or de-risking capital, let's say, and also has focused over the years on resilience and bringing resilience and making sure that investments are resilient to climate change. And I'd love to hear from you about that, both kind of your reflections on the MDB role in supporting better governance in the water sector, and then how the MDB system and others can work to increase the resilience of investments in water.
Thank you, Bella. And first, a disclaimer that I'm going to be copying a lot from Eric and JP and your team's report because I really like it. So a lot of what I'll say is in the report, so please take a look and read it. Second, when you ask people, how does climate change manifest in your life? It's almost always through water. Too much, too little, wrong place, wrong time. But I teach climate change adaptation at Georgetown University, and I always tell my students, look, but don't blame climate change for what is happening there. Turns out that climate change is just an amplifier. It's like a stove that is really bringing all of the governance failures that the water sector has, and it becomes just very real in that process. And therefore, when you're asking me what is a resilient water system, sure, okay, a resilient water system is the one that provides services. You don't get services, you don't get water supply services, you don't have irrigation services, you don't have access to groundwater resources, well, you're not resilient, period. It's as simple as that. Second, pollution is now becoming a really important part of resilience, and the AIB report highlights that. And because when you look at UN water, and they look around at how many of the rivers where they have data are polluted, 56%. So once you're polluted and you get more variability in your flows, right there, then it becomes even less usable in that process. Third, resilient water system is the one that is very efficient. When you're having water losses that Tim was talking about at very high levels, or when you don't know on how much you're losing. I remember I worked in Tajikistan, Dushanbe water utility was losing 90% of the water in that process. So you're not going to be able to be resilient. You have a little drought and then boom, you're gone in that process. And it's the same on losses in irrigation canals. It's the same actually on the water flows across countries where certain crops are cultivated in areas where there's not enough water. All those inefficiencies really go against a water system being resilient. Fourth is what Tim was talking about, is that transparent and inclusive coordination between actors, because when there's no coordination, whoever has the most agency or the most power is the one that grabs the resource, and therefore everybody else becomes less resilient. You don't have mechanisms of coordination, you can't be there in that process. And finally, one that doesn't get too connected in this discussion with climate change, but I always like to bring, I'm the chair of the board of the Water Integrity Network, and it is corruption in the water sector. You know that in our last report, we found that out of the financing that goes into the water sector, 26% is lost through corruption and inefficiencies in project preparation. And therefore, if you are having these pressures from climate change, and 26% of the money is getting lost, then really that you can't have a resilient system. But then you tell me, look, but when I studied water resources management in my college times, early 90s, this was regular water resources management. So again, it's the message that climate change is amplifying the governance weaknesses that the sector had in that process. But then what else is new? What is needed to really make these systems more resilient is what Arunawa was saying, is better data. Our ability now on Earth observation systems, on water distribution losses, on groundwater systems is just orders of magnitude better than what we had 15, 20 years ago. And that is going to be one of the more fundamental tools for us to know what's happening. We're able to know whether El Niño or La Niña in the next 6 to 12 months is going to come or not. That changes the landscape clarity, and Eric's report is highlighting that process. I think second, given the variability, we're going to need better and smarter storage systems, both physical and natural. And I think that that's what the report comes and says very clearly. You need better buffers to deal with water scarcity. You need better buffers to deal with the floods of the future. Third, something that the water sector is not talking too much. There are other sectors that seem to be more advances on the financial architecture. Everybody is very focused on the project finance, but there are very few water utilities that are really leveraging insurance products. Okay, Uruguay, water utility, half of it comes from the power utility, half of it comes from hydropower, the other from oil, and therefore they have a catastrophic bond mechanism, whether they have droughts or whether they have oil price crisis. So I think that there needs to be a lot more creativity on the financial architecture for resilience of the water systems. And then I think that the capacity of the sector to understand well climate change. So how many water utility managers, how many irrigation agencies are aware that we are at the border of potentially a super El Niño in the next few months? How many are really ready with the plans to tackle that? Very, very, very few. Okay, so these are all elements that are coming to this process, and I think that how the MDB architecture and the system begins to tackle is really first breaking internal silos. The institutions are still, the ones that have been working on this are the agricultural guys here, the water guys here, and all that process. And I think the message from the report that an AIB is trying to do, okay, let's cut it. Let's cut the silos. Second, building the capacity of the water sector professionals to understand the risk of climate change. There's still those silos in that process. I think that they have financial instruments that haven't come yet to the water sector. And I'll conclude with one final thing, that we think when we talk about resilience and adaptation, we very quickly go into, yes, let's prepare for that. But the reality is that you always need to have this battle on the mitigation side, because the way that we're going, there's going to be thresholds crossed that on the water sector that are just unsustainable. Once the glaciers melt, there's no way to replace that storage capacity, period. There's no way. You can't do that in any other way. Once you begin to start depleting groundwater resources to certain places, there's no way. And therefore, when the World Bank calculates the migration that is going to happen due to world climate change, it's all because of water, because the agricultural production in certain rural areas is not sustainable, it's not feasible, and they're not going to be surviving. And therefore, yes, let's talk about resilience and adaptation, but the battle on climate action on the mitigation side should not be forgotten. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Eddie, and thank you especially for that message of, we cannot adapt our way out of this. We also absolutely need to keep our attention on mitigation. But I wanted to pick up on your point about breaking silos and turn to Andrea. I mean, breaking silos is what you need to do to adopt a systems approach. And I would love to hear more about how the Nature Conservancy thinks about taking systems approaches, how you work in the space of water management and governance. Really, where do you see the most important levers for that systems approach?
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for the invitation to be here. I want to congratulate AIIB again on that report. I have spent a lot of times going to meetings with guys in dark suits talking about nature, and they're like, lady, I think you're in the wrong meeting. And this was so much fun to see this report so expertly done to bring forward all those key messages about what seems really obvious to us in the nature community is like, hey, water comes from nature. And if we're going to have water, we probably need nature too. And so the statement of value is one of the first things that we try to think about when we think about we're doing nature conservation, but if we're incorporating water management and trying to engage with those who depend on water, which is all of us, we need to work with these sector leaders who are investors or they're utilities or they're ministry leaders or they are the investor community in the private sector. And their language is often economics. What's the economic value of nature? and those benefits that flow from beyond that value of nature into water and from water onwards into jobs and other things. So, we've done a lot of that work, and there's a really, really clear case that's very tangible. There was a recent study in the United States that water supply can cost up to 10 times more if you have not protected your watershed. That's a clear cost that communities are bearing right now. We did a study several years back. We looked at about 1,000 cities, and we decided roughly about 1,000 of, we looked at 4,000 cities, and about 1,000 of them could actually be giving better water quality and quantity today to their ratepayers if they incorporated into their investment package work in the watersheds, protection, restoration, working in agriculture, not separate from. It's not a side gig. It's part of the investment package. We have great studies from Cape Town that restoring the catchment to the most amazing biodiversity in Cape Town actually will return 2 months of water to the city of Cape Town for 1/10 of the cost of a desal plant. Well, what water manager wouldn't want to do that first? So it's not that the economic case is not there, and in fact, we did a study with Forest Trends, the Nature Conservancy, 10 years apart. We looked at how much could we discern, doing, kind of the research that you can do, desk research and interviews, that was going into nature-based solutions, protection, restoration, and enhancement of natural infrastructure. And then later, 10 years later, how much can we discern is happening now? What we found is investment is going up. It's somewhere in the area of $50 billion right now in either transfers to landowners or through ways that the investment can flow through the bulk water users. Half of that is coming from China in their payments to land users for water security outcomes. But it has doubled in the global value has doubled in the last 10 years. But more interesting to me, the bulk water users that we have been working with and making that case for them and helping them find their way through on governance, they have gone up by 11 times. 11 times growth. So when we come back to nature and we're like, hey, are people getting the story? I think they're getting the story, but we are still working on how to structure that story so it's very accessible. So you mentioned we work on water funds, and that's one way that we have helped community to try to structure governance. And these are very bespoke to different communities. It can be driven by the utilities. It can be driven by corporations who are holding the problem, but they don't see the governance in place to try to bring together stakeholders, upper watershed, lower watershed stakeholders, to figure out what is the science-based, economically sound plan for resolving what water security problems we can solve through nature-based solutions. And clearly, it can't be everything. We still need gray infrastructure. We still need pipes and all of the rest. And that's been successful. We've done that in about 50 communities around the world. And one of the things that we found is the most important sort of solid outcomes are when the public sector is very much at the table, and we've worked into the governance problems and policy problems in the public sector. So you can't just put up a whole bunch of people putting their money together and saying, hey, let's go get it done and call it done. It won't work long term. But a utility manager knows his problem is coming from up watershed. He doesn't have the institutional boundaries to be able to work up watershed. And so figuring out how to open up the gates to investment in natural infrastructure, and that sometimes work with their regulators to say infrastructure has a broader definition, but also defining for them mechanisms by which they can make that investment, because a utility usually doesn't have a bunch of people that know how to work in agriculture, social inclusion processes, participatory processes. So you need to give them mechanisms, whether that's work with your environment ministry, work with your agricultural extension group, or work with an NGO. You need to give them mechanisms. And so you're building, the platform for investment is through what is the business case, convene those actors in a new way, find ways to come to the table and give them the tools to be able to work outside traditional constraints. And then we need to move to the financing mechanisms, and we will go on to that a little bit more. But again, it's tariffs over long-term, tariff reform to invest long-term. It is private investment from corporations, foundations, philanthropies. But the evasive part has been the investment sector, and we just launched in Cape Town a bond for the investment in their catchments with the Rand Merchant Bank. And so we're starting to see the structures that might bring forward the private bond markets to support us in this journey. And I'll leave it there.
Fantastic. Arnaba, do we have time to ask you one quick question, or do you have to? Okay.
About 2-3 minutes.
Perfect, great. No, he's got to catch a flight, so, we don't want you to miss that flight. So I wanted to move kind of to finance and to, we talked about governance. Obviously, we could talk about that for much longer. Let's talk a little bit about finance. And I just wanted to ask you, Arnaba, about the role of the private sector and, in achieving the great ambitions that the MDBs and the World Bank laid out this week, and really kind of how the ministries of finance and MDBs can play a role in that. So if you wouldn't mind giving us a little bit, and then we will say thank you.
Sure. And before I answer that, I just want to 300% endorse the kind of way you laid it out, because this is the whole point. We need a governance architecture that brings in nature, because the water utility folks don't have the nature element. They're not managing the forests. They're not managing the agricultural systems, etc. So creating that platform then enables the finance to flow slightly more easily. And it still doesn't remove all the obstacles, but it certainly is absolutely now central. I think if you just think about the water forward strategy that was put out yesterday, and a lot of it is consistent with what we put out in the book, I think the role for multilateral development banks, whether it's the AIIB, whether it's the World Bank or others, is at the fundamental level, first and foremost, to please ensure that this new governance architecture emerges. If we're going to just rush in for, let's just get one more project done and one more program financed, we'll miss this opportunity where the new science, the new data, the new insights on resilience, etc., informs us that a different way of structuring this is necessary. That's step number one. The second thing that is needed is, ultimately utilities are kind of place-based, but the choke points are elsewhere. So the MDBs can have a role, along with national development finance institutions, to connect that place-based utility with the choke points somewhere else. And that is that new kind of blendedness of, is it public finance that's going to protect the upstream forest? And is it de-risking from the MDB along with private finance that is helping to build that utility? That structuring has not yet happened, right? So you might still get public and MDB finance or private and MDB finance for the project, but it's still not solved for the choke point upstream. That's another thing. The third thing, which, and we were having this discussion at the World Bank yesterday, I think there's a huge, very large, low-hanging fruit, which is in the circular economy of water. And we've pushed that very much in the book. I've just published, we estimate, for instance, in India, that it's a $35 billion market opportunity. And of 500 odd cities we analyzed, only 8 are currently reusing any used water. So it's a huge opportunity, let alone the job creation potential, etc. Because wastewater is basically then wasted water. And when you start looking at the circularity, then the role of MDBs becomes interesting, because then you are helping to create a market that doesn't exist. You're helping to trigger a new offtake for reused water, whether it's in industry, whether it's in data centers, et cetera, et cetera. So helping the utilities that currently have a linear way of thinking about water to think about this in a circular way, think about new revenue streams in water, energy, fertilizer, et cetera, is you create a much larger program and platform for it. And my last thought here is that I think there is a role to try and help the subnational governments and city governments think about green and blue bonds. And I think the MDBs will have a role to help structure that, because right now, just think about an average city in a developing country doesn't have the best balance sheet, right? Even if the country overall might have a decent kind of credit rating. Now, how do you firstly pool projects? You have pooled bonds across multiple cities and geographies. But then if you're combining the green and the blue, you protect the forest, but you also protect the wetland, you also protect the water infrastructure, but you're creating an entirely new class of credit instruments that this level of governance has really not tapped into. So I think really what I'm saying is become the market makers that you're mandated to do. So I would really have loved to have stayed on for this. I'm sorry I have to rush.
Oh, thank you so
I hope we
much.
can carry on this conversation. And thank you very
Thank you
much.
so much. Thank you for those contributions. We're really grateful that you were able to make the time. Eddie, I want to turn to you and kind of pick up on these points from Arnava about how do we use public capital most strategically in this? Where are the places, where is it that public investment from AIIB, from MDBs, from donors, where should they be directing their resources?
Look, that's a difficult question because the World Bank, with their Water Forward report yesterday, put the price tag of everything that we're talking at about $1 trillion a year. So there's not $1 trillion a year of public funding in that process, but to be frank, we don't know how much money is going to the sector. So those of us who work in the climate change adaptation space, we always looked at CPI's reports on the tracking. Where is the money? Who's putting the money? Who's that? And we've been, for example, you guys were the first ones to prove that African governments are putting more money in adaptation than what the grants that they are receiving from OECD countries. That they are actually 80% of the money that is going to adaptation comes either from their budgets or from loans. So it is those numbers that we don't have in the water sector, and I hope and I encourage you guys to start thinking about we need those numbers to really be able to understand. You don't have that. On the other hand, everybody tends to think that public money is the most important part of the process, and the reality is that it's not. When you have 1 billion people that don't have access to water, but they need to drink water, guess where are they really? The investment is coming from those people that are drilling the wells, that are working with the informal and small-scale providers that are doing all those processes. When households don't have 24/7 hours of service, then they are investing in the water tanks. So believe it or not, the majority of the funding that our hypothesis that there is coming to the water sector is not even public, okay? Now, the other thing is that there's no more public funding, and in part because the water is not valued. And I don't mean only tariffs, but valued in the true financial, economic, and social sense in that process, and everything that goes behind, in nature, all that process. So you don't have that value, you don't make informed choices of public resources that needs to go into this sector, and you don't understand how much you need to leverage our instruments to bring others in that process, because at the end, water financing is everybody's business. Okay? And it's the national, it's the subnational government, it's the MDBs, but it's also, remember that the public development banks in the world have a lot more capital than the MDBs. Okay? So, and it is the not only the large private sector and the equity investors, but it's also the smaller scale providers and it's the household. And therefore, being able to understand and to mobilize all those sources is what's going to be needed to achieve the $1 trillion, the $1 trillion per year in that process. Now, one of the challenges is that yes, there's not $1 trillion a year today, and therefore that means that we need to be a lot more efficient and cost-effective on every dollar. Every dollar needs to count. Every dollar that comes to the water sector needs to count a lot. And I mentioned the corruption as one of the processes, but also it's in terms of technology, in terms of services, in taking sure that every drop of water counts. Otherwise, there's not enough money in that process. And that's where the trade-offs that so far in the water sector have been what I call hidden, because there's in every country a good 20 to 30 agencies that touch water and don't touch it and don't have the clear trade-offs. And believe it or not, climate change is the one that is making those trade-offs really apparent. It is through the floods and the droughts and the pressures between different uses that are beginning to argue, and now the Colorado River is finally beginning to say, look, these agreements that we were just happily going along because there was enough water no longer count. So I think that those trade-offs are beginning that process. So public understanding better where the money is coming from, being able to value the water so that you make more informed choices, being able to use every dollar of public funding the most cost-effective way to do that process, but also being able to coordinate the very diverse landscape of financiers that come to the water sector, I think is part of the solution in this process.
Thank you. Eddie, I really appreciate that overview. And what I'd like to do with our remaining time on the panel and with the three of you is to really get into specifics about models that can work, that are working. Andrea, maybe starting with you and the water fund model that TNC, that Nature Conservancy has really pioneered, and if there are other models you want to mention, I think it would just be great to have a real strong understanding today of what are models that can work.
Yeah, so we generally call them watershed investment programs. They can take different forms. But we're trying to get at the point that you've got to look at the entire system of the watershed to be able to see clearly what it is that you need to invest in and what is that economic case, and then the social and environmental outcomes as well for water. The water fund model, as we iterate, it's different than your fund, just to clarify. We don't actually manage a bunch of money. What it is a local capacity to structure together collaboration. And so it could be, as it is in Quito, Ecuador, this was one of our first water funds, where the city of Quito and their utility and energy company knew that they had a problem of loss of the upland habitat where water is stored in the system, the high Paramo grassland system. And it was being degraded. And they knew that, and they needed a way to think about how to invest in protection and restoration of those highlands so that they didn't have to continue to build more pipe and reservoirs into new areas to capture new water. And so they saw that as a positive thing to try to do, and we helped structure that by bringing in the science to sort of talk about what exactly needed to be done, how much needed to be done, how much would it cost, what would be the return for them in terms of water. The other stakeholders, Coca-Cola company, local beer companies, people that, corporations that had major stakes in that water availability. And then the social sector that could work with those communities. So it's a collective action platform. It has a vision of what we're trying to accomplish together that meets the needs of water security, but it will also have social and environmental outcomes. And, has a plan with a deadline on it and funding behind it. And so City of Quito reviewed their tariff structure and then dedicate a part of their tariffs to this water fund. And over time, we've been a part of that journey and supporting them in different things, but pretty much as an independent entity at this point in time. So it becomes its own entity. We've seen also very good examples where it's embedded within the public sector, and they're setting up ways by which they're it's more like networked governance, where different agencies, whether it's environment and water and agriculture, plus the private sector and NGO sector, are all agreeing on a common plan and those common outcomes, so you can do it in a more networked way versus setting up new institutions. But, the key thing is, do you have a solid understanding of the outcome you're searching? Do you have a way of tracking your outcomes to report out to your investors? And do you have, at the end of the day, a winnable plan? I mean, it comes down to like any other investable product, even though it's in the water sector, you sort of really need to be clear with your stakeholders. What is the winnable plan?
I love that. Andrew, I think it's a good tee up for you. What are the winnable types of investments that you've been finding? Can you give us some examples of where you're investing?
Absolutely. So when we looked at the water sector, we took the sort of ridge to reef approach and said, within these different parts of the value chain or the sector chain, where do the real assets exist and what do they actually do? And there are 12 of them. I won't go into the detail of it, but largely it pretty much follows that water molecule all the way through its cycle of life from the ridge until it ends up in the ocean. Now, along the way, there's a whole bunch of different real assets that have a role to play, and I'll give you an example of it. We have two funds. We have one fund that actually does the development of projects, and we have another fund which actually builds the project itself. Our loss rate is probably about 3 out of 4. That projects that actually don't make it through the development cycle for all sorts of reasons. So it's quite a high mortality. But the ones that do come out actually turn out to be quite interesting. And what the sector and the instrument of blended finance enabled us to do as pretty conventional project financiers is to actually get quite funky about what we could do. Our most funky deal that we did actually was a debt for nature swap around the Galapagos Islands. You'll be very familiar with it. We put $90 million into that as an equity check into quite a highly structured transaction which extended the area of the marine protected area around the Galapagos Islands. The benefit, obviously, of that is the marine species that actually live within the terrestrial, and arising from that is the vibrancy of the ocean and its sequestration characteristics. So for us, it wasn't actually a nature asset, it's a climate asset, it's a carbon sequestration asset, and the more vibrant it is, the better it is, the more it sequestrates, which is good. That was one example. That was the first time you've seen commercial capital, and this is money from pension funds and the likes going into these type of investments in very far parts of the world. We had money from Danish pension funds, South African pension funds, investing in the Galapagos Islands through these instruments. Another example, municipal solid waste. We developed 2 municipal solid waste projects in Thailand. Half of the tonnage that arrives at the gate is actually water. So we thought it was actually a waste project. It's actually a badly packaged water project. And what do you do with that? We're doing a mine water treatment project, again, in South Africa. We're doing a large bulk water abstraction, transfer, treatment, reticulation, and septage project in Kenya called Sabaki. We're the developers of that, and we'll be the financiers of that. We are doing, we did water kiosks. We did mobile water kiosks also in Kenya on rural boreholes to treat the water and make it more potable on a pay-per-use basis. It didn't work. I mean, the technology worked, the commercial model didn't. So we've got a whole bunch of kiosks which actually are moribund, but they still work, but the model didn't work. We have a business which actually did containerized ballast treatment water. Put it on the dockside, treat the ballast water. Also, technology worked, the actual commercial model didn't. So these are the things that we do. A lot of loss, but that's fine. You know, in the world of blended finance, in the world of development, loss is not a bad thing. It's slightly painful, but you learn.
I appreciate you telling us about your failures in addition to your successes. I don't think we get that enough in panels, but I think it's also maybe a nice segue to Tim, where you do work in a lot of last mile communities, and which are more difficult commercially. And so I'm curious kind of what you can tell us about financial innovation in those types of communities.
Okay, I'd love to, but just before I do, I'd like to go back a bit to, well, a little bit like what you're talking about, and also echoing the points made earlier by Arabama about making the most of a circular economy, and Andrea's points about nature. So it's just such a simple thing that's started to work. In South Asia, we all know that the weather patterns have changed. You know, you're getting areas of South Asia where 10 storms are now 1 and all the water comes at once, and because it's been dry, the ground is super hard and it runs off. And so this, in an area where there's a lot of extraction of groundwater, there's not as much replenishment happening as used to. Rainwater harvesting, which is very well-established technique of gathering water from the skies, particularly in built-up areas. But what we've started to do is the storage fills up very fast when you get these huge storms. you run the excess into old wells and use nature's reservoir. And we're seeing old wells that had long dried up come back into use as a result. So I just wanted to give yet another example. And I think I like that one because it's so, not everything's simple, but there are some very simple solutions out there. But I'm going to come back to your question. You were asking about, the hardest to reach. I wanted to give just a few points on this. First of all, lots of people think that the poorest people in the world won't be able to pay for water. The truth of the matter is that the poorest people in the world pay far more, like 100, 200 times more than anybody in this room pays for water. And that's because they don't have access to piped water. And so therefore, if you want water that is portable, you're buying it bottled, or you're getting it tankered, or you're a borehole. It's a little bit like in the energy sector, the difference between a home generator and transmitted electricity. Similarly, I think that's about 100 times more. And of course, even worse is women carrying water, which wastes vast amounts of time, as well as exposing women to injury. And one of my favorite statistics in Lagos, more than half the population of Lagos spend more than a third of their annual income on water, because the piped water is just not there. So there's an enormous informal private sector meeting that need, but it's incredibly inefficient. There's a market opportunity there, right? And in my experience, again, if you provide a good quality piped water supply, which is vastly cheaper than the alternative, poorest people are very happy to pay, and often it can lead to other livelihood opportunities. I remember meeting a woman in Ethiopia, rural Ethiopia, who had created a little business where she'd created a shower, which was for a small fee members of the community were using. So you're getting hygiene benefits there as well, and a livelihood one. What is sometimes needed in these situations, and you see this all over the place in the developed world already, is cross-subsidy, particularly for the connection charge. So, because that's often there's a capital outlay, which is hard for the very poorest. And we also need to be aware of the fact that the cost per head of providing water will be dramatically variable across the country, and just factor that in. So when you're looking at something like Water Forward, which is, I think a very, very exciting initiative, I'm very excited about it, but you do need to be careful about it just being about the numbers, because if you do, you can then, if you only focus on the people for whom you get the lowest cost per head of reaching them, you won't reach the poorest. But overall, what I would say is two big messages. One is, let go of an assumption that the poor can't pay for water, because it's poor are paying far more. And secondly, in the way that we design these big programs, set KPIs that ensure that everybody gets reached, and use cross-subsidy to make it happen.
That's a fantastic message. So we have just about 10 minutes. I would like to get a couple questions from the audience. So what we'll do is take a couple questions and turn it back to the panelists for final words and to reflect on those questions. So let me see, I think William, if you want to go ahead and there's a question right off the bat here. I would like to take a couple. So if you have a question, please also raise your hand. And please just let us know who you are.
Ruhi Abdullah from the World Bank. Thank you so much for the discussion. It's a fantabulous panel. So my question is for Andrew. Andrew, on the fund side, what is the return on investment that you actually look to make it a feasible risk-taking mechanism? Because obviously you've laid out that there are pros and cons on both sides, but I just want to understand what is the baseline that you would use as a thumb rule for ROI on making the deal. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for that. Do we have any other questions? Oh, great, out in the back.
Hi, Hi, good afternoon. My name is Radha Duganjiva. I'm with Dalbert Catalyst. Thank you for the wonderful panel. I wanted to ask, and I was so excited to listen to the summary of the AIIB's report, that finally the MDBs are coming around to the importance of nature. But I was also at the launch of Water Forward yesterday, and I did not hear that. I listened very, very closely, and I didn't hear it. And so my question to the panel is, what will it take to get the rest of the MDBs on board with the nature agenda when it comes to water? Thank you.
Wonderful question and a great way to end. Let me see if there's one more. Jennifer, great to see you.
Yeah, thanks for the great presentation. We didn't hear much about technology and innovation and how you finance that and the risks of that, but I think that could be, I was just wondering what people think about that topic. Thanks.
Okay, JP, do you have a question?
Sure.
Okay.
We in the report, we said many things about payment for ecological services, payment for environmental services, transfers, and so on. But do you have, but we also struggle a little bit with whether or not there are real cases and real examples to make this really work, either within the domestic boundary or cross-boundary. Maybe you can share some of these possible ideas. Thank you.
Okay. I see one more hand. I mean, let's get the questions out. I know we may not be able to address all of them in detail, but it's good to hear what you're thinking about. So last question, please.
My name is Yue Li. I come from the World Bank Chief Economic Office for Infrastructure. One is first, I'm a former member working with Eric and JP. Just want to congratulate my team, former teams and manager for excellent report, following from cross-border work to nature as infrastructure. And then, so given that, I think maybe I have one kind of a little bit question to JP on the research part, and then one general question on the governance part. So the research question is, again, really excellent report, and then just one minor question. When you have the cross-country analysis, looking at the correlation between forest, land, different land use, you point out the build-up is extending build-up kind of seem to negatively correlated with water and water resources. I just kind of curious if we're thinking more policy implication, do we have more nuance in the message beyond just the area, like the shape of the buildup, of the density of the buildup? So that I think would lead to our future thinking about how to make city works for water and nature. That's one. Second is just linked to that because my own research interest so much on urban, and I heard, okay, although everything is think about systematic, but at the end of the day, when we think about the governance and the policy, even the bond issue, we talk about subnational government. So I want to hear from you, what's your view on how we empower subnational government for them to lead this effort.
Okay, thank you so much. So we've had questions on nature, on technology, on ROI, on governance. I'm going to hand it over to the panel one by one. I'm happy to start with whomever feels ready. Just to give us your summarizing, concluding thoughts, if you can work in a little bit of the response to these questions, I think that would be fantastic. But who would like to begin?
I'll go ahead.
Wonderful.
I love the question about how to make sure that the MDBs are really embracing this agenda. So it's a fantastic start that AIIB is putting this out so clearly. I think one of the challenges I saw and what I heard yesterday is nature continues to be seen as sort of a bolt-on, third pillar, fourth pillar, fifth pillar. Instead of nature provides water. Start from the beginning. It's just kind of a little mind switch, and I know it comes from a culture and a sector that is mission-driven and professional about delivering clean water through pipes and things like that, but it is that flipping of where does it come from. And so when I look at the pillars that are described in that strategy, I see an opportunity for embedding all the way through that, but it takes changing some processes. Like master plans have to be built by people that have a broader perspective than engineers. Love you guys, engineers. Much more has to be done to think about our water security. I mean, you guys know if you go into a meeting and like there's people missing from that meeting, you know that you're going to come up with a biased outcome from that meeting. Not because the people in the room are bad, but because they're missing perspective. And so master planning before, banks become involved in investable projects. Thinking deeply about, as Mr. Ghosh said before he left, is we are calling the world to look differently at what we need for collaboration and networking and governance to reflect the world we're going into. And we do need to start from that level. And so there could be policy reform policies or policy reform processes that the banks could do to really get at that. So there's tools and processes embedded in this system, and each one of them has an unlock that we need to go through. And so that would be my recommendation, is to really get serious about what would it take to design the world we're going into, not the one we came from. I would love to share more examples we're not going to do it today, but there's more examples that we can share on examples on the ground that have tangible results and community members you can talk to. We have a website, here it comes, Resilient Watersheds Toolbox, Resilient Watersheds Toolbox, where you can find a whole bunch of materials on the approach, the science, and the community, sort of examples that can come forward. In it, we're working on some interesting technology stuff that is coming forward. I mean, decision support tools that really allow collaboration. They're just better now than they used to be, bringing things together. There are things like working on satellite imagery to be able to see what's changing in pollution and sediment loading in waters. We never used to be able to see what's the water quality before. We can now begin to see that. There's some new technologies that help us really connect what happened in the climate event, what happened in the structure of the watershed, to then, and including in agriculture, and then what it shows up in the water, therefore what is the cost downstream to a water manager. Like that starts to become clear that we can make those cases come forward. And that's, there's still so much to do, but there is more technology available to us than there were in the past. More investment needed.
Thank you. Who would like to tackle this?
So I can have a shot at the ROI question. And I'm going to answer in 4 parts, if you don't mind.
Very short 4 parts.
Very short 4 parts. Okay, without getting lost in the technology, or the technicals. So return on capital, actually, if you measure it from an equity perspective, is very different to measuring from a debt perspective. So an IRR is different to an interest coupon. Our model is an equity model. What that enables you to do is actually extend your IRR determination period to a long term, which means that if you're doing a 12% IRR over 5 years versus over 20 years, it's very different cash flows. So it gives you tenor extension, and we finance these things on 20 years from an IRR perspective. That's the first point. Second point is that, it's both equity and IRR. The third point is that inflation helps hit the numbers. So when you talk about a return, whether it's IRR or a coupon, you're talking nominal numbers. And inflation compounds. So if you put your money out there for 12% over 20 years, and you've got inflation in these jurisdictions, you've got that working to your benefit. It's a very different number to a real return. And that's important with this because these are patronage assets as opposed to power assets, which tend to be priced in real terms. That's the third point. Fourth and final point is that through the blending of capital in a fund, which has different return requirements, you can, and we price it probably about 10%. In reality, we probably get 8% into the fund, but we can then strip that and deliver something between 12 and 15 to a commercial investor, which is what a pension fund requires, by using insurance instruments, which lower the cost of capital, or using first loss of concessional nature. So the return on capital number, or the cost of the capital number, can be determined at project level, fund level, or an investor level. But finally, you've got to price your capital against the useful life of the asset. Giving short-term money just doesn't help. You've got to match it.
Eddie, did you want to?
2 points. On technology, we finished a report with a Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure last December, where we were analyzing technology and resilience and adaptation. And the ROI on technology and the speed of development is just amazing. But the real challenge is that institutions are not ready to be able to leverage all of that technology, and communities are not able to tap into that technology for better informed choices. And therefore, that's, to us, the most important barrier. On subnational governments, the issue is that is lack of empowerment of those subnational governments to do that process. And we may talk about blue bonds and green bonds, but if a subnational government is not able to issue a dirty bond, you cannot issue a blue bond, okay? And therefore, having the books, having the clarity on what are the flows of funds, having the clarity on the tariffs and the subsidies, the transfers, all of that is part of the national government. Don't blame the subnational, help that subnational take the action on that process. And then on water forward nature, I think that MDB is one of the challenges they have are the internal silos. There are no MDB that has the environment team and the water team in a single unit working together, and therefore the biases are right there. And unless you fix those, and I'm not saying that you need to change the boxes, but unless you change the mechanisms by which people work across boxes, and instead of reorganizing as these institutions do all the time, put as much energy that you're putting the reorganization into working across boxes. So.
Yes, fine. I'm going to give a response on the nature one and then have a couple of final concluding points. I'll keep it quick. On nature, I just think, speaking for my own sector, the days of people focused on WASH, providing water for communities, which was, you dig a hole deep enough and everything will be fine, are long gone. And so, for instance, in Bangladesh, how do you solve problems of saline intrusion along the coastal area? Replenishment of mangroves. In Burkina Faso, a country where the water table is dropping purely because of weather change, we are doing things like planting trees, sand dams, stone bonds to try to preserve the natural reservoir under our feet, along the same lines as I was mentioning earlier. So I think actually, although maybe organizational boundaries in the World Bank don't help us, I think nature's unavoidable, and completely with you on and want to work together with organizations like yourselves on solving these problems. Secondly, I think, the 2 points on sort of reflection. I think one of the key, I'm not a financier, but I think one of the key problems underlying all this is that water is something which has multiple benefits. So it benefits nature, which wouldn't exist without it, benefits people's health, their education, gender equity, boosts the economy. It actually, I think, increasingly contributes to national security. And how do you connect, if you want to finance this, how do you connect the person who benefits from this with the person who pays for it? And I think that is a tricky problem, but I actually believe that most of the world's remaining difficult problems are like this. I think the days of vertically integrated solutions to things are long gone, and this is just what we need to embrace, the complexity, and find a way forward. I think that water forward is an admirable thing which we need to get behind and make it work. I like the framing. I think it has brought the three main aspects of water together, and I think that's a good thing. And I also think, finally, water is one of the, unfortunately, relatively rare areas where the world can still collaborate and do something useful together. And actually, I think that's not to be missed. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, that's, JP, would you mind maybe responding directly to her, or would you like to? Okay, very quickly, great.
So there is a clear hierarchy about, there is a very clear hierarchy about the ability of the land to store water and to propagate water. So forests and wetlands are the best. Agriculture and grassland, they also contribute, especially if agriculture, if you do it well, for example, terrace farming and so on, instead of cutting, right? But I think the large-scale deforestation definitely is bad for water transmission, bad for storage. You really asked a question about urbanization. Urbanization, definitely, sprawl is negative. We have a chapter in the report, right, about Ramsar, the wetland protection. We found that, unfortunately, even though some of the wetlands are protected by Ramsar, a lot of wetlands are still being encroached by urbanization. So urbanization is actually eating up into some of the Ramsar areas, particularly in poorer developing countries. And that is the part that you turn a positive sign to a negative sign. So if there are policy messages, policy nuances, is to maybe help developing countries better implement the protection of the Ramsar, of the areas, and plan urbanization in a better that doesn't sprawl and maybe more contain and keep nature intact. Thank you so much.
Super, thank you. Well, I really like what you said, Tim, at the end, which is embrace the complexity. This is what we all need to do. We need to get behind this incredible momentum on water, driven really by the announcement yesterday by the UN Water Conference at the end of the year. This is the moment. So please do join me in thanking this incredible panel and the AIIB. And have a wonderful rest of your week here in Washington.